In our last session, we got through John chapter 8 with the exception of the last two verses, really, and that was very unfortunate that we ran out of space on the tape before we took those verses because they are an organic part of the whole discussion that precedes them, and it's somewhat more desirable to treat verses in their context rather than in a separate session. And those verses, John 8, 58 and 59, are important enough that we cannot simply content ourselves with having no record of them or no treatment of them. So I'm going to put in here at the end of John chapter 8, take those two verses, and then we're going to go on and take John chapter 9 in this session as well. In John chapter 8, Jesus had made some claims about himself, which had caused some of the Jews to say they believed in him, or at least to feel that they believed in him. It says in John 8:30 that when he spoke these words, many believed in him. And in verse 31, Jesus said to those Jews who believed in him, "If you abide in my word, then you're my disciples indeed." So he did not accept without question that all those who were believing in him were going to be persistent and true disciples. And as he began to talk to them about their need to be made free from sin, some of them were not willing to admit the need for this, and they began to appeal to their pride that they were Abraham's descendants, which sort of underscores for us what must have been a very prevailing Jewish attitude in that time, that being descended from Abraham was itself sufficient to save a person. That if a person was descended from Abraham, promises had been made to Abraham and to his seed. If they could show that they were in fact descended from Abraham, that would prove that they were to be participants in the blessings promised to Abraham. But we know, of course, the Apostle Paul understood it differently, and from this ensuing passage we know that Jesus saw it differently as well. Paul indicated that the promises were made to Abraham and to his seed, but that seed does not refer to plural seeds, all the Jews, in other words, but it refers to a particular seed, Christ, so that the promises of God to Abraham are fulfilled in and to Christ and those who are in him. This is how Paul expands on that subject in the 3rd chapter of Galatians. Well, Jesus talks that way here too, because while he acknowledges in verse 37 that they are Abraham's descendants, he challenges their claim to be Abraham's children, which is an interesting distinction to make. They are physically descended from Abraham, it is true, he says in verse 37, but in verse 39, he says, if you were really Abraham's children, you'd do the works of Abraham. And he points out that they were doing works very different from Abraham because they were seeking to kill him for no better reason than that he had told them the truth. And he said Abraham didn't do this kind of thing. And another difference between them and Abraham was brought up later on in verse 56, where he says, your father Abraham rejoiced to see my day and saw it and was glad. Now Abraham was glad to see Jesus. These people who claimed to be his children were not glad to see Jesus. They didn't rejoice in Jesus' day, in his appearance. They found him troublesome. Now, of course, in saying that Abraham rejoiced and was glad to see Jesus' day, the question naturally arises, when did Abraham see Jesus? In fact, the Jews raised that question themselves in verse 57. Then the Jews said to him, you are not yet 50 years old, and have you seen Abraham? It's interesting that they say he is not yet 50 years old. You know, there's one of the early church fathers, Irenaeus, who is actually a disciple of Polycarp, who was himself a disciple of the Apostle John. So the succession is the Apostle John, Polycarp, and Irenaeus, pretty close to the apostolic times. Irenaeus made a comment in one of his writings that Jesus lived to be almost 50. This is not taken as a serious, historically reliable statement by any scholars, because the Bible specifically says that Jesus' ministry began at around age 30, and it's hard to imagine 20 years of ministry to be sandwiched into the Gospels. It would appear that it was more like 2, 3, or 3.5 years of ministry, and therefore traditionally we understand Jesus to have died at around age 33. And no one knows for sure why Irenaeus, seemingly so inaccurately, indicated that Jesus lived to be nearly 50, but some have suggested it might have been based on this statement of the Jews, when they said, you are not yet 50 years old. Irenaeus may have deduced from this that Jesus was close to 50 years old, which is why they picked that figure. But it's probably not a reliable one. In all likelihood, Jesus was not yet even 35, much less 50. Now, why they would select the number 50 is curious because, even if Jesus had been 50 years old, that would not have caused him to live long enough to see Abraham. Abraham had died 2,000 years before Jesus came to earth. And therefore, the selection of the number 50, you are not yet 50, would seem almost arbitrary, if not for the fact that they may have assumed that was something like his age or close to it. And that may suggest that Jesus looked haggard and he looked older than he really was. On the other hand, of course, maturity can give the impression of age, even where physical features do not. It's often the case that a person who looks young and is young is mistaken for being older because of maturity or wisdom or whatever, and that's perhaps a better reason for believing that, for suggesting that they thought he might be nearly 50, if that's what they thought. In any case, it is striking that they would say, you're not yet 50 years old, when in fact he was probably not even close to it. Now, I guess we might ask ourselves, before we go further, when did Abraham see Jesus? Jesus said, Abraham rejoiced to see my day, and he saw it. Well, when did he see it? Well, we don't know the answer to that. It's possible that Jesus meant that Abraham foresaw it, that is, by prophetic vision, or by the promise of God that was given to him, he looked forward to it, and in his faith vision, he foresaw and looked forward to and rejoiced in the coming of the Messiah and the coming of Christ. This would be probably agreeable with Hebrews chapter 11, which speaks of Abraham and Sarah and Isaac and Jacob. In Hebrews 11:13, of those persons I just named, it says, these all died in faith, not having received the promises, but having seen them afar off. They saw them afar off, not with their eyes, however. They were assured of them and embraced them and confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims on the earth. Now, Abraham and his immediate successors saw the promises of God afar off and embraced them by faith. The promises certainly had to do with the Messiah coming, the seed of Abraham. And the writer of Hebrews might be telling us that Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Sarah saw, by faith, as it were, a day that would come. They embraced as real, because of their faith in the promise of God, a prospect of the coming of the Messiah, and rejoiced in that prospect. That is possibly what Jesus means when he says, Abraham rejoiced to see my day, and he saw it and was glad. Perhaps he saw it by faith. He saw it as a prospect that he knew God was going to fulfill because God had promised. So in his mind's eye, as it were, he could see the day of the Messiah and rejoiced in that. Other suggestions have been that perhaps on some of the occasions we read of in Genesis where Abraham met with God, that on one of these occasions, or all of them, this appearance of God was in fact Christ himself, appearing in a theophany or Christophany prior to his incarnation. We know, for example, in the 18th chapter of Genesis, that it specifically says that Abraham was sitting in the heat of the day under a tree, and he saw in the distance 3 men who came to him. One of them was specifically said to be Jehovah. The other 2 were angels. They were on their way to Sodom and Gomorrah. And they stayed with Abraham briefly, had a meal under his hospitality, and then went on their way after God told him what he was going to do to Sodom and Gomorrah. Now, since one of these persons that Abraham saw and fellowshiped with was Jehovah, it's possible that that is an occasion when Jesus is referring to Abraham having seen him, or seen his day. It's also possible that when Abraham met Melchizedek in Genesis 14, at the end of that chapter, possibly that was Christ. There are reasons to believe that, especially when one considers carefully and faithfully what is written in Hebrews 7, and allows the wording of that chapter to be taken seriously. It would seem that Melchizedek was Christ come in a pre-incarnate Christophany, or theophany. And not all evangelicals hold that view about Melchizedek, but I can't see my way around it when I study Hebrews 7. And that being so, we know that Abraham saw and received a blessing from and gave gifts to Melchizedek, and therefore that might be what Jesus is referring to when he says that Abraham saw him and was glad. Jesus, however, doesn't answer their actual question. When they say, when did you see Abraham? He doesn't give them a straight answer. Says, it was on such and such an occasion I saw Abraham. But he addresses rather the root of their objection. The root of their objection is, you're not yet 50 years old. You haven't been around long enough to see Abraham. They actually ask for specifics. When did you see Abraham? And rather than give them that specific, he addresses the issue of their misconstruing his antiquity. They took only into consideration his earthly life. He had not been on the earth so much as 50 years, and obviously he could not have in those years have encountered Abraham, who had died 2,000 years earlier. But what they didn't understand is that he had a pre-existence as God, and therefore predated Abraham by a great deal. And so in verse 58, Jesus said, "Then most assuredly I say to you, before Abraham was, I am." Now this is a familiar passage to, I guess, well-read Christians who read their Bible. It's a striking passage. Most of us know that it amounts to a tremendous claim on Jesus' part to being somebody special, and particularly being God. Not all who read it, however, agree that this is what he's claiming. For example, there are those who think that Jesus' words should be translated, before Abraham was, I was, or I have been, so that he would be saying nothing more than, I existed in a pre-incarnate form before Abraham ever existed. Now, if that is what Jesus was saying, it'd be an entirely true statement, and we have no problems with that concept, that Jesus existed before Abraham. And certainly, that fact of his preexistence is included in his statement. He is affirming that before there was an Abraham, there was him. But his actual wording is saying far more than just that bare assertion that he was around before Abraham was. Because in the Greek language it would have been possible for him to use the past tense, and most natural for him to do so, if all he wished to say was that he preexisted before Abraham's time. He would have, of course, said, before Abraham was, I was, or I have been, and there are Greek words that convey that. There are Greek tenses of the verbs that could have been used to say that, and that would have been very natural. However, he does something very unnatural. He says, before Abraham was, and then in the Greek he says, ego, eimi. Ego is spelled like we would say ego, E-G-O. When Freud decided that man was made up of the id and the ego and the superego, he got the word ego from the Greek language. It means I. Ego, I. Really more properly pronounced ego in the Greek. And eimi means, if it's all by itself, it just means I am. You don't even need the ego part to say I in I am. Eimi by itself, which is spelled E-I-M-I. E-I-M-I. By itself, eimi means I am. But when you put the I before it, I am, it's just emphatic. I am. Now you can say I am by saying eimi, or simply by emphasis by saying ego eimi. Jesus said ego eimi, and one thing that's striking about this statement, regardless of what our theories are about why he used the words, one thing that's obvious is that it is in the present tense. It cannot justly be translated with a past tense, because it is not a past tense of the verb. It is the present tense of the verb, and it means I am, or it can also mean I am he. As I pointed out in our last session, it is a regular, generic expression for someone to say I am or I am he. They can say ego eimi and mean either one, and context would usually help out in determining which they have in mind. But, for example, I pointed out last time in John 9, just the very next chapter after this, John 9 and verse 9, the blind man, when some were discussing whether he was the same guy after he was healed, whether this is the same man that had been blind and whom they had known as a blind man, some said, this is he. Others said, he's like him. He said, I am he. And once again, the words of the blind man are the same, ego eimi, the same as the words of Jesus in John 8:58, and also in John 8:24. Where Jesus had said in John 8:24, therefore I said to you that you will die in your sins, for if you do not believe that I am he, you will die in your sins. Again, I am he, there in the Greek is ego eimi. It could be translated just I am, or I am he. It's quite clear that in John 9:9, when the blind man said ego eimi, the correct translation is I am he. And it could be that every place in the Bible, ego eimi could be translated I am he, including John 8:58, where Jesus said, before Abraham was, ego eimi. We could translate that, before Abraham was, I am he. It'd be quite legitimate to do so. The Greek allows it. But that still doesn't explain why he uses the present tense. Whether he says I am or I am he, however we prefer to translate ego eimi in that case, we still have to deal with the fact that he uses the present tense. Now, in Exodus chapter 3, Moses encountered God at the burning bush. And God commissioned him to go to Pharaoh and to the Jews and to inform them that God was delivering the Jews from Pharaoh and going to establish them as his people outside Egypt. And Moses anticipated that the Jews would question the legitimacy of Moses' claim to having such a commission. And Moses said, well, they'll probably ask, who your name is, God. I mean, what God sent me. What is your name so I can tell them? And God said to Moses on that occasion in Exodus 3, he said, I am that I am. You tell the children of Israel that I am has sent you. And because God so clearly declared his name in Exodus 3 to be I am, the natural thing for Christians in reading John 8:58, where Jesus said, before Abram was, ego eimi, is to say, oh, well, Jesus is using the divine name, which was given to Moses at the burning bush, as God's name. He's referring back to that incident. And therefore, we have in John 8:58, Jesus claiming to be the same God that met Moses in the burning bush, the I am. Now, this is entirely possible. And almost all Christians I know, including myself at one time, felt like that is really what was intended by Jesus when he said this, that he was actually trying to hark back to the incident in Exodus chapter 3 at the burning bush. Now, persons who are opposed to the doctrine of the deity of Christ, and probably chief among those would be the Jehovah's Witnesses, have pointed out that in the Greek version of the Old Testament, in the Septuagint, when you read Exodus chapter 3 and that interchange between Moses and God in the Septuagint, the Greek words that are used to translate God's divine name, I am, are not the same as here. They are not ego eimi. John, of course, was written in Greek. Exodus was originally written in Hebrew, but was translated into Greek in 285 BC. And that Greek translation, the translators did not choose to use the words ego eimi in Exodus 3 to translate God's divine name. Now, of course, what choice the translators of the Septuagint made is hardly relevant in terms of the ultimate nature of things, but what is significant is that Jesus and his generation were familiar with the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, and of course the apostles in their writings almost entirely, when they quoted Scripture, quoted from the Greek translation of the Septuagint. Jesus also would have been familiar with the Septuagint. And John, who wrote these words, remember Jesus spoke in Aramaic, John translated into Greek here. Now the point to make is this. If Jesus in fact used the same words when he said, before Abram was, I am, if he used the same words for I am that God used in Exodus 3, and if John, being familiar with the Greek expression used in the Septuagint in Exodus, wished to convey to us that Jesus was using the same words, he would likely have used the same Greek words that the Septuagint used when translating into Greek. You understand that concept? I mean, it's not certain that John would have done so, and there's nothing that would have compelled him to. It just seems to be the natural thing for him to do. If he's trying to give his readers cause to make this connection in their mind, Jesus was claiming the same thing to be the God of the burning bush here, then one would expect that John, in translating whatever Jesus said in Aramaic into Greek, would have chosen the same Greek expression that the Septuagint writers, which was familiar to everybody in John's day, had used to translate God's words into Greek in Exodus. And this, John did not do, which, as I say, the Jehovah's Witnesses and perhaps some others as well would say that indicates that John, in writing this, did not believe and did not understand Jesus to be referring back to Exodus 3 at all, or the divine name that's found there. In response to this, a number of things can be said. One is that could be correct. It could be correct that John doesn't understand it to be so, and that Jesus was not, in fact, referring back to Exodus 3. It is also possible, and this is an alternative that needs to be considered, that John, who was, as it says in the book of Acts, an unlearned and unschooled layman, may not have read the Septuagint that much. And he may not have been very familiar with the way the passage in Exodus 3 read in the Septuagint. He might not have been familiar with what Greek words were used there. Hard to say. He may have. It may be that he did understand Jesus to be making a reference back, but John didn't look it up in the Septuagint to see what Greek words were used. Therefore, he chose some words which worked well, but were not the same ones. That's a possibility. A third possibility is that Jesus, when he spoke in Aramaic, was in fact referring back to what God said in Exodus, but John didn't catch it. John didn't know it. He just recorded what Jesus said, and it never occurred to him to look back at the Septuagint and see whether the words he used were the same there. I mean, those are all possibilities. I don't know that all are equally probable. I'm saying, however, that the difference in the Greek words here from those in the Septuagint of Exodus are not conclusive against the thought that Jesus was referring back to the burning bush when he spoke. But I allow the critics the point that Jesus may not at all have been referring back to Exodus. He may not have been appealing to the divine name there. But there are other places in the Old Testament where the divine name is given, and it's not always the same name. Of course, God has many names by which he called himself, and most of those names are used in the New Testament of Christ. One of those divine names is found frequently in the middle chapters, or somewhat late of the middle chapters, of Isaiah. The first of them being quite early in Isaiah chapter 41 or so. 41:4, that's right. Someone made a total list on a previous occasion. There is a complete list I've given you when we went through Isaiah also. Isaiah 41:4, we read, "Who has performed and done it, calling the generations from the beginning? I, Jehovah, am the first, and with the last, I am He." Now, without even paying special attention to the expression first and last, which is applied to Jesus in the book of Revelation, and is here applied to Jehovah, we have the expression, I am He. Now, in our Bibles, you can see that the am is in italics, so that in the Hebrew, there's just a word that says, I, He. However, when the Septuagint translation was made of this passage, and like passages in Isaiah, the translators chose to use the Greek words ego eimi, so that God said, I, Jehovah, am the first, and with the last, ego eimi, which can be translated I am, or I am He. The fact is, these words, the very words used in John 8:58 to translate Jesus' statement, are the words in Greek that were used by the Septuagint to refer to this divine title. Now, someone could argue, but this isn't a divine title. God's just saying, I'm He. That's kind of that could be stated more or less as just a statement without there being a title implied in it. Yes, John? It is. 46:9? I'm sorry, 46:4, yes. I'm not sure about 46:9. Let me have a look there. I don't think it's there. I am God. Where it says that, I am God. No, I don't think we have ego eimi there, but I'm not sure about that. It is not one of the passages where this particular phrase is used in the manner that is, I think, specialized here of God, because in Isaiah 41:4 we have that, but it's the first of many cases. In chapter 43 and verse 10 of Isaiah, in 43:10, God says, You are my witnesses, says Jehovah, and my servant whom I have chosen. So he's talking to Jehovah's Witnesses, right? You are my witnesses, says Jehovah, and my servant whom I have chosen, that you may know and believe me and understand that ego eimi, the Septuagint says, that I am He, or I am. Either translation is possible. And before me there was no God formed, nor shall there be after me, etc. Then in Isaiah 43:13, it says, Indeed, before the day was, I am He. Again, the ego eimi in the Septuagint. Now here we come to something special, because in Isaiah 43:13 we come to the first instance where this word is used in a way that spells it out clearly as a title, as a label that God uses for Himself, a distinctive technical term, rather than just the ordinary statement, I am He, which anyone might make in different contexts. Here we have Him saying, before the day was, I am. Okay? Now the form of that sentence is just as awkward as Jesus' statement, before Abraham was, I am. Because, of course, When you say before such and such was, it'd be more proper to say I was, not I am. It's awkward. It's awkward because it's non-grammatical. It violates the natural use of grammatical rules, and it does so giving the indication that ego eimi in this place is being used, as in the other like places in Isaiah, as a title. It does not change with the grammatical structure of the sentence. It is not dependent on the tense of the other verbs in the sentence. It stands as an unchanging title. Likewise, in Isaiah 46:4, God says, even to your old age, I am He, or in the Septuagint, ego eimi. And even to your gray hairs, I will carry you. Now, you can see, even to your old age and even to your gray hairs is talking about something future. That's clear, for example, by the second line. Even to your old age, I will carry you. That's future tense. But the first thing is, even to your old age, I am. You would expect him to say, I will be. He's talking about something future. But again, we find the unchangeable tense of this because it is a title, a divine name. It is being used as a divine name. Now, the important thing about all this is that even though the Septuagint did not use the words ego eimi, when translating Exodus 3 and the divine title there, they did in all of these places in Isaiah where Jehovah uses this as a title for himself. And we have much closer parallels there in Isaiah to the use of this expression than that is to John 8:58, than we do in Exodus. Because we have him saying, before the day was, ego eimi. Jesus, before Abraham was, ego eimi. It's a similar sentence. It's a similar usage. And therefore the evidence, I believe, is favorable to the supposition that Jesus was, in fact, claiming the divine title for himself, but not the divine title as found in Exodus, but that which is found so many times in Isaiah, which is Jehovah's own title. Now, whatever actual words Jesus used in Aramaic, the language he spoke, we may never know because we only have the Greek translation of them here in John, but we know that his original hearers certainly recognized the words he spoke and their implication. And it says in verse 59, then they took up stones to throw at him, but Jesus hid himself and went out of the temple, going through the midst of them, and so passed by. So, the fact that they took up stones to stone him was due not to the fact that he was claiming to have been around longer than Abraham. For that, they could have just said, you're nuts. In fact, they had said something like that in verse 48, just a little earlier in the same chapter, when the Jews answered and said, do we not rightly say you're a Samaritan and have a demon? In other words, they're saying, you're nuts. You're crazy. You're demonized. No one who's in his right mind could say such things as what you're saying. But they didn't just, say you're nuts here in verse 59. They obviously took him to be blaspheming, to be claiming to be God, which is why they took up stones. And for that reason, we have to assume that regardless of what we're concluding from the translation we're left with, those who heard his original words in the original language made no mistake as to the nature of his claim. He was claiming to be Jehovah God. And so they understood him. Okay, moving along then. John chapter 9 is a story, a very appealing story actually. It's really kind of neat. It's not just another miracle story of Jesus, of which there are many in the Gospels. It is, of course, a miracle story, but the miracle takes place early in the chapter, and the rest of the story is about the one upon whom the miracle was performed and his interaction with the Jewish community and with Jesus later on. And this makes it a very unusual miracle story because, as you probably know, if you think about it for a moment, all the other miracle stories about Jesus in the Bible, they tell of the miracle, and then you hear nothing more about the person. What happened to him? I shouldn't say we hear nothing more. We usually hear they went out and told everybody, even though Jesus told them not to. And that's the last we hear about it. Or that Jesus sent the man of the tombs back to his city to testify, and we read that he did, and he went out and testified throughout the Decapolis. But, in those cases we have nothing more than a short statement summarizing what that person did immediately after he was healed, but not in any sense giving us much detail about his specific conversations with people and so forth. So that the focus of chapter 9 momentarily is really upon the man who is healed more than on Jesus who healed him. However, of course, Jesus is prominent at the beginning and the end of the chapter, and he is the one being discussed and theorized about throughout the chapter. Therefore, of course, it is about Jesus. But it's interesting about this guy. And one thing that has been pointed out many times, it's by preachers anyway, is that this man who is born blind and healed by Jesus makes a good sermon to liken him, by way of analogy, to a person who gets saved. It's obvious from the Bible that those who are not believers are in darkness. They're blind. They don't know God. They're blind to spiritual things, and they walk in darkness. The Bible says this in many ways, in many places. And the man being healed is like a person coming out of darkness, out of blindness, having his eyes opened by the touch of the Master, by coming to know who Jesus is. And the things that happen to the man after this have often been seen as analogous to some of the experiences of the Christian after conversion, having to explain his conversion, having to handle objections from disagreeing parties, and even living initially with a bit of an inadequate theology, but being loyal to Jesus because he knows he's been touched and he's been changed. And so as we read the story, I think we are justified in seeing that there is a connection here. For one thing, because in John's Gospel, as I pointed out before, more than in the other Gospels, in John's Gospel, the miracles that are selected to be told, to be recorded, are mostly those that have a spiritual analogy that is intended. And this is no exception, because back in John 8 and verse 12, Jesus said, "I am the light of the world. He who follows me shall not walk in darkness, but have the light of life." And it would appear that the next miracle we read of illustrates this point, that a man who is born physically blind in physical darkness represents the person who was spiritually blind. And Jesus, the light of the world, offers this man and provides for him light for his eyes, natural light, and that as a symbol of spiritual light. So also, at the end of the story, Jesus makes comments that seem to make a spiritual application of the entire story, because he says in verse 39 of John 9:39, Jesus said, "For judgment I have come into this world, that those who do not see may see, and that those who see may be made blind." And some of the Pharisees who were with him heard these words and said to him, "Are we also blind?" And Jesus said to them, "If you were blind, you would have no sin. But now you say, 'We see,' therefore your sin remains." Throughout that entire little exchange, verses 39 through 41, blind and seeing is clearly not a reference to physical blindness. Jesus didn't come to make seeing eyes blind. And when he says, "I came to make blind eyes see," he probably was not referring simply to the few cases where he actually healed blind people. But his mission, in the larger sense, was to cause those who were spiritually blind to see. And when he says, "If you were blind, you'd have no sin," he obviously isn't talking about physical blindness, because physical blind people can be just as sinful as others. He's saying if you really were ignorant, if you really had no light whatsoever, then you might be held less accountable. You would have more innocence. But because you have light, and you claim to have light, therefore you're held accountable for what you know, and therefore you're more sinful, you're more guilty. Excuse me. As you know, I've had a cold. It's a little worse in some ways today than usual. Not as bad in some other ways. I'm recovering. Let's read the story. "Now, as Jesus passed by, he saw a man who was blind from birth. And his disciples asked him, saying, 'Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?' Jesus answered, 'Neither this man nor his parents sinned, but that the works of God should be revealed in him. I must work the works of him who sent me while it is day. The night is coming when no one can work. As long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world.'" Now, all this conversation took place before Jesus did anything for the blind man. He and his disciples are passing by. They see a man who's been born blind. The disciples knew that this man was born blind because they mention it. Who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? That means that he was a rather familiar person there. The disciples had probably seen him before, and most of the people around seemed to know who he was. As we know further on in the story, everybody seemed to recognize him and know him as the local blind man. So this man had been probably for a long time begging, in all likelihood, next to the road, and it gave occasion on this circumstance for the disciples to raise a theological question that many would ask. And it's kind of fortunate for us that it was asked so Jesus could give an answer and it be recorded for us. The question is, who sinned that this man should be born blind? Now, they offered two suggestions, this man or his parents. Now, to suggest that the man sinned and therefore he was born blind, it may seem at first to suggest that he had a preexistence in which he sinned, so that in this life he was born blind as a consequence of his previous sin. That is how reincarnation advocates understand this verse. Of course, most reincarnation advocates don't appeal to Scripture very much, but where they think they can, they do. And this is one place. They say, you see, the disciples must have believed in reincarnation because they figured this man may have sinned so as to cause him to be born blind. And if that were true, he would have had to have sinned in a previous life. Well, I disagree with that, but even if it were true that the disciples believed in reincarnation, certainly Jesus' answer would disprove reincarnation, because he said this man nor his parents had sinned, and that would prove that it wasn't bad karma. You know, the reincarnationist would have said, in fact, he was born blind because he had sinned. He had bad karma from a previous life. And even if that's what the disciples believed, which I do not believe I don't think they did, and I don't believe they implied that. But even if that were their view, it stands corrected by Jesus. Because when he says neither this man nor his parents sinned that he would be born blind, he is specifically saying that this condition the man is in is not the result of any misbehavior on anyone's part, his own or anyone else's. It is obviously, therefore, not the result of bad karma left over from a previous lifetime, and therefore it goes right against what reincarnation and karma doctrine would teach. So even if we wish to grant the New Age people their assertion that the disciples believed in reincarnation, we have to go far enough into the passage to know that even if they had believed it, Jesus corrected it and said they were wrong. Now, it's not necessary to assume that the disciples believed in reincarnation or in a previous life that this man had lived. They were obviously struggling, as most people would, to figure out why anyone would be born blind. It's conceivable that a person who does something wrong in their lifetime might suffer disaster, might suffer, sickness or handicap or some bad thing as the result of that. But why an innocent child should be born blind, it boggles the mind. One suggestion would be that his parents had sinned. I mean, it's just a possibility. If, for example, his parents had been promiscuous, if his mother had been promiscuous and she got syphilis, a child could be born blind as a result of that. And the child's sin would not be a factor, but his mother's would be. Although that wasn't the case here. There are some cases where the sins of a parent might bring some kind of a harm upon their unborn child. It has happened before. Children are born crack babies because of the sins of their parents in many cases. But obviously that was not relevant to this case. The other possibility was that this man was being punished for his own sins, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the disciples were suggesting the possibility that he had lived a previous lifetime. Because the disciples would have understood, as a Hebrew would, that God knows the future. That God knows all things future. I mean, the whole prophetic scriptures of their Old Testament were a demonstration of that fact. And therefore, it probably did not seem impossible to their minds, in their desperation to grasp some kind of rationale for this man being born in this condition, if not his parents, then was it possible that God foresaw that this man would be a sinner in his life and in advance handicapped him for it? If God is able to foresee the future as if it were the past or the present, then it would be no difficulty for him and no injustice for him to punish a person even prior to their committing the sin, because he knew they were going to do it. And that might be what the disciples were thinking. But again, if that's what they were thinking, they were wrong. Whatever they were thinking, they were wrong. In this case, it was neither the man's sins nor the parents' sins that entered into his condition. Now, lack of faith is a sin. Whatever is not of faith is sin. Therefore, we can also say that this man's condition was not a result of lack of faith on his part either. Because Jesus said he had not sinned. It was not his sin that caused it. Not to say the man had never sinned. Of course, the man, like anyone else, was a sinner. But Jesus was saying there was no connection between his condition that he was in and any sin that he had committed, including, although Jesus doesn't make this point, but we'd have to include in that, the sin of unbelief. And I say that for obvious reasons, because there are Christians today who believe that if you have enough faith, you can overcome and be rid of handicaps and sickness and so forth. Jesus didn't indicate that this man had any control over this at all. His moral decisions, his spiritual life, his choices had nothing to do with him being in this condition. This condition was brought on him by God. Now, how can we say such a thing? How could we say that God would bring such a condition on him? Well, Jesus implies it. He says in verse 3, neither this man nor his parents sinned, but that the works of God should be revealed in him. If this was the work of the devil, if the devil did this to him, and God was not in the picture, it's hard to imagine why the devil would put this man in this condition in order that the works of God could be seen in him. Now, that the devil may be in the picture as the one who afflicts is not disputed. In the book of Job, the devil brought Job's sickness to him, but only with God's permission, because God had a purpose for it happening. God was never squeamish about taking responsibility for people's disasters. It apparently never occurred to God that this would argue against his justice or his mercy. And by the way, it shouldn't occur to us that it does, because it doesn't. It does not argue against his justice or his mercy. God is certainly within his rights to do such things. And if it brings glory to himself, that's his business to do. Now, I would remind you that when Moses stood before the burning bush, he complained that he was not quick of speech, and he was not very qualified to speak before Pharaoh. And in Exodus chapter 4, the Lord answered him. Exodus 4:11. The Lord said to him, who has made man's mouth? Or who makes the mute, the deaf, the seeing, or the blind? Have not I, the Lord? Now, this is an interesting statement, because the Word of Faith people say, no, the devil is the one who makes people blind and mute and deaf, and God's only concern is to change their condition. But that's not what God said. He said, who is it who made people mute, deaf, seeing, or blind? Isn't it I? Didn't I do it, God said? And he's implying he did. He makes people born with vision or born without vision. That's his business to do. Now, if somebody is born handicapped, we will not argue whether or not God has allowed the devil to do it, or whether God has done it directly apart from any agency of the devil. But even if the devil is involved, that's not the significant point. The significant point that God makes in Exodus 4, and which Jesus makes here, is that God had a purpose in this handicap. God had a purpose in this person being in this condition. In this case, it was so the works of God could be seen in him. And in this particular instance, the works of God were to heal him. Now, by the way, the works of God can be seen in a handicapped person, in a disabled person, even if they're not healed. Because the principal work of God is that which he works in you to will and to do of his good pleasure. That's the supreme miracle, when God takes a rebel heart of a born, confirmed sinner and changes their whole orientation to be a lover of God and a lover of righteousness, and to will and to do God's good pleasure. That is the work of God. Jesus even said, when his adversaries said, what must we do that we may do the works of God? He said, this is the work of God, that you believe in him that he has sent. That itself requires a work of God, even for you to believe. That's a work of God. Now, I'm probably putting a slant on that particular statement that is not implied, but the point is, the only work that God does in sick people is not necessarily to heal them. There are other works, even greater works than these, no doubt. And in fact, Jesus indicated that his own resurrection was a greater work than any of the healing works he had done. And God's going to resurrect all of us from the dead too. That's a great work. The work of God can be seen in our infirmity. As Paul himself said about his infirmity, he said, I'll rejoice in my infirmities, because when I'm weak, then I'm strong, because God's strength is made perfect in my weakness. When I'm weak, the work of God is made more evident in me. In this case, and in many other cases, the work of God in the life of the disabled man was to heal him. And we can hope in the mercy of God that He may heal us if we are in similar conditions. But we can't demand it, nor can we say that if God doesn't do it, that He's not doing something important, or that He's not doing the right thing. At the pool of Bethesda in John chapter 5, we are told there was a great multitude of sick and impotent folk waiting for the waters to be stirred by an angel so they could go in and be healed. Jesus, we are told, approached one of those people. Of this great multitude of sick people, He approached one, and without even being asked by the man, Jesus just healed him. Jesus initiated the whole thing. The man didn't even appear to have a great deal of faith, but Jesus just healed him. He said, "Get up, take up your bed and walk." The man did it, and Jesus and the man apparently left the scene. And there are a whole bunch of impotent sick folk that Jesus didn't approach and do that to. Why? Well, He doesn't owe us an explanation. There are other things God can do that are just besides heal the sick. Healing the sick is a very nice thing in many cases, but it's not always, I guess, the best thing. In this case that we're reading, however, though, the work of God was to heal the man. But even if that were not the case, it can still be said that whatever sickness or handicap we have that we are unable to shake, that those are there too, that the works of God might be seen in us. The work of His grace in our lives, if not also the work of healing us, which is also a possibility. Now, when Jesus said in verses 4 and 5, "I must work the works of Him who sent me while it is day. The night is coming when no one can work. As long as I'm in the world, I am the light of the world." The impression that is given here is that He's using day and night as metaphors, respectively, of His presence and His absence. I must work the works of God while it is day, meaning while He's alive on the earth. The night is coming when no one can work. Could presumably refer to when Jesus is no longer able to do anything. He's going to die. And when He says especially, "As long as I'm in the world, I'm the light of the world," just as the sun is the light of the world during the daytime, Jesus is the light of the world while He was in the world, suggesting that His presence on earth was like daytime for the world. His departure is like nighttime. And that could be how He's using it. But one problem affixes to this simplistic answer, and that is that in verse 4 Jesus says, "The night is coming when no man can work." And although Jesus, His personal work on the earth, as opposed to His later work through the church, but His personal activity on the earth ceased shortly after He said these words, and darkness of a sort came on the world by His absence, yet it wasn't the case, and it still isn't, that no man can work. We can still do the works of God. We're still required to. So it's a little difficult knowing what He meant when He said the night is coming when no one can work. If He's just referring to His departure, certainly He did not believe that His disciples would be unable to do any works after He's gone. As a matter of fact, Jesus Himself continued to work through His disciples in the book of Acts and in the present time. I'd like to suggest that the night and the day refer not only to Jesus' lifetime and His death, respectively, or reverse that, but any man's life and any man's death. For every man there is a daytime of his life where his eyes are open, where he's awake, where there's light. There's a time when his eyes shut in death, and it says it where he goes into the night of death. This is true of every man. The night comes for every man. And when that night comes, no man can work. No man can work when he dies, after he's dead. He has only one lifetime to live, and that is his daylight period. Then comes the night, and after that he can do no more works. Now Jesus is saying this, I think, generically of how it is with all men. All men have their daylight period of lifetime, and then their time is over, and they can do no more works. And therefore, it is argued, you've got to do as much as you can while it's day. And he applies that generic to his own self, because like every other man, he had a prescribed length of time he was going to live that was the day. And then he was going to die, and his earthly work, through his personal presence and so forth, would be over. The things that he had to accomplish by his personal presence could only be done within a limited time frame, and therefore he had to be busy about it. Now, later on, in John chapter 11, excuse me. In John 11, when Jesus decided he was going to go down and raise Lazarus from the dead, his disciples objected to this. And they indicated that, let's see here. They reminded him that they had tried to kill him down there in Judea before. I'm looking for the exact verse I'm thinking of. Verse 8. The disciples said to him, Rabbi, lately the Jews sought to stone you, and are you going there again? Jesus answered, verse 9, Are there not 12 hours in the day? If anyone walks in the day, he does not stumble because he sees the light of the world. But if one walks in the night, he stumbles because the light is not in him. Now, this expression doesn't seem to use the exact same metaphor of life and death that we have in John chapter 9 about walking in the day and the night coming when you can't walk or can't work. But it's a similar idea. The idea is daytime represents the time of opportunity. Every man has a daytime, has an opportunity where he can walk, he can travel. He's using, of course, the natural fact that in those days they didn't have electric lamps and so forth, and when the sun went down it was time to go to bed, really. I mean, you could burn oil lamps for a little while, but that was pretty expensive. People generally went to bed when the sun went down. And they didn't travel outside when the sun was down unless it was a full moon because they just couldn't see. You couldn't walk when the darkness came. Therefore, the period of daylight is compared with opportunity. Opportunity to walk, opportunity to travel, opportunity to do things. Night just represents the end of that opportunity. And so, what he's saying here is there are 12 hours in the day. And what he means by that, I'm talking about John 8:9, excuse me. I'm wrong again. 11:9. John 11:9. He says, Are there not 12 hours in the day? Means the day is going to be 12 hours long. Nothing is going to change that. You can't, no circumstance is going to change the prescribed length of the day. And so also the day of opportunity, or the opportunities that God gives a man to work, is not going to be shortened or lengthened by mere human intervention. See, the disciples were afraid that Jesus going down to Jerusalem might result in his being stoned. They tried to stone you last time you were there. You're going to go there again? What Jesus is saying is, hey, the day's not going to be made any shorter by the plans of man. A day's 12 hours long. A man's opportunities, the length of it is prescribed by God. And, as long as you're making the best of your opportunities, that won't be shortened by man or lengthened by man. You can't, by hiding out, avoid death. And you can't or nobody, by trying to kill you, can kill you if you're in the will of God. They're not going to shorten your daylight time because the day is a certain length of time as God has decreed it to be. So Jesus used this idea of day and night in a couple different places, once here in John 9 and again in John 11, to suggest the opportunity that a man has in his lifetime to get something done, to accomplish what he's here to do, and realizing that there is an end to that opportunity, which is represented by the coming of the night. Verse 6, John 9:6. When he had said these things, he spat on the ground and made clay with the saliva, and he anointed the eyes of the blind man with the clay. And he said to him, Go, wash in the pool of Siloam, which is translated sent. So he went and washed and came back seeing. Therefore, although he didn't see Jesus, apparently Jesus had disappeared at this time from what we gather. The man went and washed, but after seeing Jesus was no longer around, and not immediately. Therefore the neighbors and those who previously had seen that he was blind said, Is not this he who sat and begged? Some said, This is he. Others said, No, I think he just looks like him. But he confirmed it, I am he said. Therefore they said to him, How were your eyes opened? He answered and said, A man called Jesus made clay and anointed my eyes and said to me, Go to the pool of Siloam and wash. So I went and washed, and I received sight. Then they said to him, Where is he? And he said, I don't know. Now, why did Jesus use clay? I don't know. I don't have a clue. I doubt if it had curative properties. Okay, I doubt if clay, has some kind of organic or mineral or some kind of curative properties. So I don't think there's anything like that involved. I think it was obviously symbolic. Jesus had the raw, naked power to just heal without any such emblems. But many times he did things in a way as to, convey something. what he was conveying is not entirely clear. It is possible, it's been suggested, that since God made man from the dust of the earth in the first place, that here was a broken or a damaged article, and Jesus, the God who created man in the first place, is here patching up the damaged specimen, with the same substance. And so it would be symbolic of the fact that he, the same one who created man from the dust, was able also to do repairs on the same, and using dust as the common denominator to make that correlation. And that's possible. In fact, it sounds pretty good to me, to tell you the truth. I don't know if that's the reason he did it. We're never told why he did it. One thing is interesting is that Jesus healed a number of blind men, but he never did it the same way twice. Sometimes he put his hand on them, sometimes he put his finger on their eyes, sometimes, as in this case, he put mud in their eyes or something. It does appear that Jesus avoided any kind of methodology that could be systematized and imitated. He made it clear that although he sometimes did hand motions and did things and said words and so forth associated with his miracles, he didn't do them all the time or repeatedly. He did it differently often enough to show that the power was not in any of the ritual. The power was not in the mechanism or in the methodology. It was not the case that there was a certain formula for success here that Jesus had mastered like a magician or a sorcerer would. The fact of his doing it differently on purpose every time probably argues for the fact that he wanted to avoid giving the impression that if you do these certain motions, this is how things get done. It's not the motions, it's the authority of Christ. And so I can't say with any dogmatism why he used clay in this case. I made a suggestion that may make sense, but may not be the reason. In any case, we see that this is the only time he did this precise method. And there is a fair amount of focus on the method in this story. The people say, how did this happen? He says, well, he put clay in my eyes, I washed them, and came out seen. But even though the story is retold several times in the chapter of how Jesus did this, and people are interested in hearing how he did it, the real issue in the chapter is not really Jesus' methodology, but whether he had the right to do it, and what this miracle has to tell us about who Jesus is. So the people asked where Jesus was. The man didn't know. Now, he was at this point talking to his friends and neighbors, apparently, who had known him before. It says in verse 8, therefore the neighbors and those who previously had seen that he was blind, they didn't recognize him. They were his friends and neighbors, but he was so different. And you can see how that would be the case. A person who could see would be operating, his just movement through a crowd would be entirely different than a blind man. His expression on his face would be different because he'd be reacting to visual stimuli which he had never reacted to before. The man looked enough like the same guy that they raised questions. Is this him? But he was different enough that they wondered. And apparently it wasn't until he confirmed it, yeah, that's who I am, I'm the one. I'm not just someone who looks like him. That they really knew for sure it was him. Which is often the case when people are converted. People who knew them before hardly recognize them. There's a rather cynical anti-Christian song on an album by a group called Loggins and Messina. Some of you may know Loggins and Messina's music, but most of you are probably too young. But there's a book by, not a book, but a song by Kenny Loggins on this album called Didn't I Know You When? And it's very clearly sort of it's trying to insult a Christian. He's talking about, didn't I know you when you were a neighbor? Didn't I know you when you used to love the ladies like I do and stuff? And he says now you're passing the hat around, you're saying you're his disciple, and you're bragging about the life you left while you're bragging about the life you found and so forth. There's no mistaking the scenario here. He doesn't ever say Christian or anything like that, but it's clear that he's trying to indict a friend of his who is no longer the same. And didn't I know you when you were like me? He says. I hardly recognize you in this new form. And that's true. Not everyone sees the change as an improvement when you become a Christian, especially those that are convicted of their own sins by your having changed. But the change that takes place in a Christian life is they become a new creation. Old things pass away and everything becomes new. And in fact, some people are barely recognizable after they've been saved. I may have told you, I don't know if I did or not, but back in Santa Cruz when I lived there, there was like a mental hospital that we used to go into once in a while to do some ministry. And the first time I went there, when I came to the door, a lot of the patients, the inmates there, were kind of crowded on this little glass window in the door, and they were all looking out and stuff to see who was coming in. And there was one face at the window that just struck me when I saw it. She was an old, haggard, hag-like woman with straw-like gray hair, and just, but I mean, it wasn't just that she was an old woman. It was the particular countenance she had. She reminded me so much of the witch or the evil queen in the animated movie Snow White. You know how the queen took that potion and she became a hag. The quintessential witch figure. And I mean, when I saw that face just through the window before I even went in, I thought, man, that woman looks about as possessed as anyone I've ever seen. And sure enough, when we were in there ministering, she was in the crowd there, and I just couldn't help when I saw her thinking that way about her. And after we were done ministering to the group, we kind of spread out to talk to people individually, and I sat down next to her to talk to her. And I began to share with her some things about the Lord, and she broke down and wept because she said, I don't know if she's telling the truth or not, she said she had murdered her husband. And I talked to her about how the Lord could, forgive her and restore her and so forth. Anyway, she prayed with me to receive the Lord. And when I came back the next week and every week afterwards, she was there. But it was hard to believe it was the same woman, because she was radiant. She was actually a lovely old woman. I mean, she really was quite... she was probably 70-ish, maybe not. Maybe she just looked that old before, but she just had a wonderful countenance. And if you had seen her before and after her conversion, you could easily say, "Is this the same one?" I don't think that could be the same one. I mean, there's similarities there. Some of the features are the same, but could that really be the one? And of course, that's talking about physical, change in the way people look. More important after conversion is the change in behavior, the change in countenance and attitude and so forth. It should, in fact, be the case that once you have come out of darkness into light, that those who knew you when you were in darkness, they hardly recognize you. You should be that different. It says in 1 Peter chapter 4 something like this. It says in 1 Peter 4 verses 3 and 4, "For we have spent enough of our past lifetime in doing the will of the Gentiles when we walked in licentiousness, lust, drunkenness, revelries, drinking parties, and abominable idolatries. In regard to these, they think it strange that you do not run with them to the same flood of dissipation, speaking evil of you." They think it's strange. They can't quite make it out. This difference, this change in your life. Now, some of you never did a lot of scandalous things before you were saved, and therefore the change won't be seen so much in the fact that you don't get drunk anymore because you never did. But there should be a tremendous change in the way you relate to people and the way you handle stress and trials and things like that. Those things there are distinctive things that are changes that God makes in the life of one who's regenerated. And these things are significant enough and should be significant enough that it should surprise your old friends when they see you having gone through this change. Verse 13 then, "They brought him who formerly was blind to the Pharisees. Now it was a Sabbath when Jesus made the clay and opened his eyes." Of course, that makes it a controversial act on his part. We weren't allowed to do cures on the Sabbath. "Then the Pharisees also asked him," the blind man, "again how he had received his sight. And he said to them, he put clay on my eyes, and I washed, and I see." He's getting more brief, getting tired of telling the story. "Therefore some of the Pharisees said, 'This man is not from God,'" meaning Jesus is not, "'because he does not keep the Sabbath.' Others said, 'How can a man who is a sinner do such signs?' And there was a division even among the Pharisees there. They said to the blind man again, 'What do you say about him, because he opened your eyes?' He said, 'He's a prophet.'" He had heard nothing more than that about Jesus, but he knew he was sent from God. There could be no doubt about that. He didn't fully understand the deity of Christ. But the Jews did not believe concerning him that he had been blind and received his sight, until they called the parents of him who had received his sight. And they asked them, saying, "Is this your son, whom you say was born blind? How then does he see?" As if somebody has to defend themselves of being able to see when they were blind before, but I have to give an answer for this. His parents answered them and said, "We know that this is our son and that he was born blind, but by what means now he sees we do not know, or who opened his eyes we do not know. He is of age, ask him, he will speak for himself." His parents said these things because they feared the Jews, for the Jews had agreed already that if anyone confessed that he was the Christ, they'd be put out of the synagogue. Therefore his parents said, "He is of age, ask him." Now, here we have, this story is really interesting because it records the reactions of so many different people to this miracle of giving sight to the blind, or as we could make analogy to a person being converted. The friends are the first to notice. They ask what happened. They marvel at it, and in this case, these are religious friends. Therefore, once he's told his story, they want to know how this measures up with religious orthodoxy. So they go to the religious experts. They go to the pastor of the church. What do you think about this? Now, these Pharisees remind me a lot of some liberal pastors I've met, especially during the Jesus movement, when people were delivered out of drug addictions and major addictions without withdrawal, and healed of things, and just were totally changed. And their parents or their friends, weren't sure what to make of it. In fact, not all parents are even glad when their children give up drugs to become a Jesus freak. You might have heard about the case where a couple of people from the Anastasis in Greece actually converted a young boy from the Greek Orthodox religion to Christianity, and he was converted out of fornication and drugs and alcohol abuse and all this stuff, and he became a radiant Christian. But his mother was infuriated. She said she liked him better when he was a pagan. She'd rather have him in drugs and alcohol and so forth, and she actually brought charges because there was a law in Greece against converting people from Greek Orthodox Church, the official state church. And it looked like these guys from the Anastasis might in fact have to spend time in jail there. Things turned around for them, but but there are people who object to the change, even though the change is clearly good and beneficial. They just don't like it. And some of them are just suspicious of it because it's so unusual. They don't know what to make of it. And people who are religious, like the Jews were, they wonder how this squares with what the religious authorities would say. And so they take him to the clergyman, take him to the theologians. What do you think about this situation? This guy was blind, now he sees, and he says that this guy healed him. What do you make of it? And the clergyman didn't have any room for this kind of supernaturalism, nor for this kind of irreligion, because Jesus did it on the Sabbath, and that was particularly offensive because they didn't believe that anyone should do cures on the Sabbath day. And that was what was even more objectionable. Jesus was going about doing his Father's works, paying no attention to what day of the week it was, and they just didn't have the flexibility in their old wineskins to allow for this kind of new wine that was saying, hey, let's do the works of God and not worry about the calendar. So their religiosity, their ritual convictions and so forth, did not leave room for God to do what he wanted to do. And many churches are in that condition. If you get converted, in some churches you won't be able to stay for very long. Because there are actual pastors of liberal sort who think that being born again is a bad thing. They really are. And so these guys tried to find some fault with the guy's testimony, but what could they find? I mean, he just said, well, here's what happened. I was blind, I see. And so they thought, what are we going to do? How are we going to discredit this situation? This obviously was pointing to a move of God that was taking place outside of their religious circle, which threatened the validity of their whole religion. And therefore, they were desperate to try to discredit it. And the first way they thought they would do so is to say that Jesus was a bad guy. He broke the Sabbath, so he couldn't be from God. But not all of them were convinced of that. Some of the Pharisees even said, well, how can a man who's a sinner do such signs? So there was no a full agreement among the Pharisees on that particular objection. And therefore, they thought, well, maybe he wasn't really blind. Maybe the testimony's false. You know, we haven't seen the medical records that confirm that this man really was blind, and therefore we don't know that a miracle really happened. How do we know his testimony is true? These kinds of things just don't happen, and we have reason to be skeptical. So someone apparently thought of, well, let's ask his parents. They ought to know. And the parents were brought in, and they must have marveled. You would think they'd be delighted to see their son, who had always been blind, now restored to normal. But they were more concerned about their social standing in the synagogue. they knew his story because he'd told it, and they no doubt believed his story, that Jesus had done it, but they claimed not to know. Well, we know he was blind, but we don't know how he got his sight. We don't know who did this. Well, that was a lie. We're told that they said that for one reason, not because it was true, but because they were afraid of being put out of the synagogue. And a lot of people have been rejected by their families for their stand for Christ, not because they were really now living in an objectionable way, but because it brought embarrassment upon their families in the religious community they were in that didn't have any room for the true gospel to be having its effect on people's lives. So these people, rather than be put out of the synagogue, decided to, as it were, deny the Lord or claim they didn't know about the Lord, even though they really did. Verse 24, so they again called the man who was blind and said to him, give God the glory. This religiosity is sickening, they didn't care about God. But what they're saying is, if you're giving Jesus the glory, you're really depriving God of the glory. So let's not make any mistake. Let's not give Jesus the glory. After all, Jesus can't be of God himself. It must be God who did it rather than Jesus. We know, they said, that this man is a sinner, meaning that Jesus is a sinner. Now, the sin they have in mind, of course, is the fact that he did what he did on the Sabbath. That's what they mean, because they didn't really know him to be a sinner otherwise. In John chapter 8, he says, which of you convicts me of sin? John 8:46. And none of them were able to do so. They didn't know of any sin he committed. But they claimed to know he's a sinner because he was not observing their Sabbath restrictions. And the man answered and said, whether he's a sinner or not, I don't know. One thing I know, that though I was blind, now I see. And this testimony was hard to resist. They tried to theologically undermine Jesus. The guy says, I don't know. I can't argue the theological points with you. Jesus is a sinner, Jesus is not a sinner. I can't claim to know all that stuff. I know one thing, though. I know that he made my eyes open. I know I was blind and I see. That is indisputable. You can wrestle with that all you want theologically, but that is the fact and that's what I know. Obviously this man didn't have a comprehensive theology, but neither does any new convert. The man at this point thought Jesus was a prophet, as he said earlier. And Jesus was a prophet, but that was not a full understanding of the deity of Christ. But it's probably excusable that people who first get saved don't fully understand the doctrine of the Trinity and the deity of Christ and so forth. I believe that as they study the Scriptures, they'll have to come to that conclusion. But this man didn't immediately know those things. He didn't even know whether Jesus was a sinner or not. After all, he'd never set eyes on Jesus. When Jesus encountered the man who was blind, he'd never seen Jesus with his eyes, and he probably hadn't heard much about Jesus. So all he knows is this guy, someone who must certainly be of God, has done a miracle on him. He said, that's what I know. You wrestle with that. You deal with that. I'm not going to argue the theological points with you, he said. Verse 26, then they said to him again, what did he do to you? How did he open your eyes? Now, the man, this guy gets pretty feisty with them. He answered them, I told you already, and you did not listen. Why do you want to hear it again? Do you also want to become his disciples? Then they reviled him and said, you are his disciple, we are Moses' disciples. We know that God spoke to Moses. As for this fellow, meaning Jesus, we do not know where he is from. The man answered and said to them, why, this is a marvelous thing, that you don't know where he is from, and yet he has opened my eyes. Now, we know that God does not hear sinners, but if anyone is a worshiper of God and does his will, he hears him. Since the world began, it has been unheard of that anyone opened the eyes of one who was born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing. Now, the man had a very good theology. As I say, it wasn't altogether enlightened. He didn't know who Jesus was. He just knew that Jesus was from God. That's all he knew at this point. He also may not have been entirely correct in saying that God doesn't hear sinners. Obviously, sinners who cry out to God for mercy, God hears that. Although what he meant probably was God doesn't honor the requests of sinners about things like doing miracles and stuff like that. That God, honors his own people. He honors righteous people with that. And there's probably more truth than error in that statement. Although, of course, we know the devil can do miracles too, and his people can be given power to do that. The man may not have fully understood the nature of he may not have had a complete theology of how miracles are done or anything like that. How could he? He wasn't an educated person. But one thing he knew is that what Jesus had done could only be a work of God. It was clearly not the devil who had healed him. It was, it spoke of Jesus being a good man and being from God, and or a prophet or something. But it certainly was not the case that he was a man that God had any objections to. If he had not been of God, he wouldn't be able to do this. No one's ever heard of such a thing. From the time of beginning of history, no one's ever heard of anyone opening the eyes of one who was born blind. And so he actually makes a very strong theological affirmation, although he chooses not to debate the point up in verse 25, yet he gets around to making a theological assertion in verse 34 or 33, where he said, if Jesus was not from God, he couldn't do this. And they answered and said to him, "You were completely born in sins, and are you teaching us?" And they cast him out. So their pride was offended that here a guy who had no theological training at all was teaching theology to them, and obviously more sensible theology than they had, because they couldn't think of any sensible explanation. They couldn't dispute him, so they just threw him out. I know some churches like that too. They can't dispute your points, your biblical points. They just soon throw you out of the church instead of have to deal with the points. That is not, of course, the way that people behave who love truth. These people obviously stood to be corrected in their view about Jesus, and had they been truth lovers, they would have accepted the correction. They would have said, "Wow, we've really been selling this guy Jesus short. We didn't realize he could do this kind of thing. He must be really of God." But that's not what they were interested in. Just like the parents of the man were not interested in truth so much as their acceptance in the religious system, so the leaders of the religious system were not so much interested in truth as they were their status in the religious system and the security of the system itself. Verse 35, Jesus heard that they had cast him out, and when he had found him, he said to him, "Do you believe in the Son of God?" Now, I like verse 35 because what it says is that Jesus finds the outcasts. When Jesus heard that they had cast this man out, he was an outcast. Jesus found him. Now, Jesus healed him first, but didn't follow up on him when everything was going okay for him. But when he was rejected for his testimony for Christ, Jesus revealed himself to him deeper than before. He said, "Do you believe in the Son of God?" Well, the man had believed in Jesus the prophet. He had believed in Jesus, the man who must be from God. But he had never heard the expression Son of God with reference to Jesus, so he said in verse 36, "Who is he, Lord, that I may believe in him?" Now, this is, I think, an important thing that we see here. The man did not, prior to this, believe that Jesus was the Son of God. Not because he was against believing that, but because he never heard it. He said, "Who is he so that I can believe in him?" And I am under the impression, now I certainly don't think that my opinions about this hold total weight or anything like that, but my impression would be there may be people who are really saved who have a very inadequate understanding of who Jesus is, but who love him and would believe anything about him that he told them. They just don't know much. There are probably people in the Catholic Church like that. I'm sure there are. There are no doubt. I really get on thin ice when I suggest this, but it's occurred to me there could be maybe surprisingly people even in the Mormon Church and the Jehovah's Witness religion who conceivably, I don't say that I know of any or I've met any, and it may be they don't exist, but it seems conceivable to me that people might love Jesus knowing but little accurate information about him. And their knowledge may not even be so much as would ordinarily save a person, but it's their love for him and their belief in him insofar as they've had light about him that I think would probably be the thing that God looks at most. But if people are in that category, they will quickly believe the true things about Jesus once they hear them. Like this man. This man didn't know anything more about Jesus than he was a prophet, but that's because he hadn't heard. But he was already loyal to Christ. He was already suffering persecution for his loyalty to Christ. He was kicked out of the synagogue and out of his own family for being loyal to Christ. To say this man was not saved or not a believer would be wrong, I think. But he'd never been told yet a higher Christology. And when Jesus found him, he decided to reveal more of himself to him. And I believe that Jesus does reveal more of himself to us at times when we've taken a stand and suffered rejection and so forth for his name's sake. There's great reward in heaven for those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, and also reward in this earth, I think, because it's possible to get to know him in the power of his resurrection and in the fellowship of his suffering. And as those who had already decided to reject Jesus now decide to reject this man because of his loyalty to Jesus, this man was fellowshipping. He's getting to know Jesus in the fellowship of his sufferings with him. And so Jesus honored that and said, okay, you need to know more about who I am. Now, I guess we could theorize as to whether this man was really saved before this point. I mean, he didn't know Jesus was the Son of God, and presumably people have to know that to be saved. We could say maybe the guy wasn't saved before that, but it's hard to say that in view of his tenaciousness to stand up for Jesus against all opposition. On the other hand, you've got people like the Jehovah's Witnesses who face tremendous persecution and ridicule for their position, although they've got wrong views about Jesus. In fact, somebody said, somebody who knew these things, someone who had actually spent time in a Nazi concentration camp, said that it appeared to them that the people who suffered most and most faithfully for their faith in the Nazi concentration camps were the Jehovah's Witnesses. They were the most unyielding. They would not deny their faith under torture and so forth. Of course, we know there were Christians like that too. But someone who was there observed that Jehovah's Witnesses stood strong. Now, what do we make of this? Now, that doesn't prove they're saved. But it seems to me like if someone is that loyal to God and to Jesus as they understand him, then God will eventually honor that and bring them to a better knowledge of himself. I mean, if somebody is determined to be loyal to Jesus, then I think Jesus is determined to be loyal to them. And while we might say, well, they're not saved in this condition of this theology of theirs, maybe they're not. But I can hardly believe that Jesus would allow them to die without coming to enough knowledge to be saved if they've responded to what little light they have. But this is not, in any sense, an endorsement of Jehovah's Witnesses, because most Jehovah's Witnesses I've met aren't open-minded about who Jesus is. You know, they've got a wrong theology, and when you show them from the Bible what the right theology is, they put these blinders on and refuse to see. They are not like this man. This man had an inadequate Christology, but as soon as he heard maybe Jesus is the Son of God, he said, well, tell me about it so I can believe it. He was willing to believe what Jesus said about it, but he just had never heard it before. It's this desire to believe, to walk in the light. This is the condemnation that people have, that light comes to the world and men hate the light because their deeds are evil. They don't want to come to the light. But those who do righteousness come to the light. And this man had come to as much light as he had, and now Jesus was going to honor him with more light, and the man was quite obviously not of the sort who wanted to hide from it. He was willing to embrace it. Now, I want to make clear what I've just said and what I didn't say. I did not say that people like Jehovah's Witnesses are saved just because they're sincere or anything like that. I don't believe that most Jehovah's Witnesses are saved or are likely to get saved, because most of them are committed to an error which they are not willing to move from, even when shown scripturally that they're wrong. But I did say it's conceivable to me that there might be people who are locked in at the moment to some system of wrong theology, but who love Jesus insofar as they understand him, that they read the Bible and are doing maybe their best, but haven't read enough yet or haven't been convinced enough yet of certain things that are truer than what they believe about him. And that God, I think, will honor that. And if they're not saved yet, even in their sincerity, I believe God will make sure that he reveals enough truth to them that they will not die lost. God sees those who are willing to be outcast for him. And like in this case, Jesus came to him, found him. The man didn't find Jesus, Jesus found him. And he said, do you believe in the Son of God? And the man said, who is that, Lord, that I might believe in him? He's already calling Jesus Lord, but he didn't know this business about the Son of God. Now we might say, well, maybe this guy didn't even know that he was speaking to the same person who had healed him. It's a possibility, but he had heard Jesus' voice previously, and he was hearing it now. In all likelihood, he knew that this person who was speaking to him now was in fact the one who had healed him earlier. That's why he would immediately refer to him as Lord. And Jesus said to him, you have both seen him, and it is he who is talking with you. In other words, he said, I am the Son of God. Then he said, Lord, I believe. And he worshipped him. And then Jesus made the remark that I've commented on earlier. For judgment I have come into this world, that those who do not see may see, and that those who see may be made blind. And some of the Pharisees who were there with him heard these words and said to him, Are we blind also? And Jesus said to them, If you were blind, you'd have no sin, but because you say, we see, therefore your sin remains. Those who were in true ignorance, Jesus came to give them light. Those, however, who had light that they were rejecting, those who could see but didn't want to see, he came to make them more blind. He came to take away what light they had, he says. This is making the same point, I believe, as Jesus made in Matthew 13 when he was asked by his disciples why he spoke in parables to people. He said to them in verse 11, he answered and said to them, Matthew 13:11, Because it has been given to you to know the mysteries of the kingdom of heaven, but to them it's not been given. For whoever has, to him more will be given, and he will have abundance. But whoever does not have, even what he has will be taken from him. Therefore, I speak to them in parables, because seeing they do not see, and hearing they do not hear, nor do they understand. And in them the prophecy of Isaiah is fulfilled, which says, Hearing you will hear and shall not understand. Seeing you will see and not perceive. For the heart of this people is grown dull, their ears are hard of hearing, and they have closed their eyes, lest they should see with their eyes and hear with their ears, and lest they should understand with their heart and turn, that I should heal them. He's saying, those who have a thirst for knowledge, though they don't have any knowledge, they'll be given more. Those who don't have a thirst for knowledge will have what little knowledge they seem to have taken from them. Because although they see, they refuse to see. Although they hear, they refuse to understand. Far be it from them to allow themselves to see, hear, and understand so they could turn and be healed, he says. That's not in their plans. And so he came with light. And when he brings light, people who are receptive to light will receive it. People who love darkness will wince, and they'll turn back, and they'll move from the light. People with some light that they don't like will be made blind. And that's what Jesus said he came to do. Now, the Pharisees said, Are we also blind? I'm not sure why they understood him to say that, but they must have been convicted when he said that. He said, if you were blind, you'd have no sin. And that simply means if you really had a genuine ignorance, if you had no light, you would not be accountable, at least not as accountable as you now are, because you claim to see. Therefore, your sin remains. It is not the case that anyone is truly, completely blind. If they were, that is spiritually, if a person had no spiritual sensitivity at all, Jesus indicates they'd have no moral responsibility either. Without spiritual sensitivity, there's no moral responsibility. However, there's no one who has no spiritual sensitivity. Even non-Christians who've never heard the gospel have conscience. They have the creation crying out to them that there's a God. There is nobody who is devoid of light altogether. There are many, however, who pretend like they have no light and prefer not to see it, and those are the ones whose sin remains. And, responding to the light you have, I think, is what he's talking about there. People who are willing to respond to the light will be given more. People who are not will have taken from them even what little they have. Well, we're out of time, but we've covered the material, so we'll stop right there.